Hello, APUS students. This is Chapter 36, American Zenith, 1952 to 1963. This is part one of a two-part lecture because there is a lot of content in this, so I'm going to break it up into two parts. When we look at the title of this chapter, Zenith basically means kind of, the peak of something. And so this is a time that really represents a peak of American prosperity economically, and there's a lot of, social prosperity at home. But we're also going to look at, how the Cold War was ramping up, and how there are some undercurrents, of counterculture and dissent that are going on during this time. So let's get started. As we spoke about in the last lecture, the United States was an economic superpower after World War II because of the amount of industrial production that we had remaining. Continued inventions combined with increasing opportunities for higher education is going to cause the United States to transition from an industrial economy to a post-industrial or service-based economy with more high-tech and what we call white-collar jobs as opposed to blue-collar jobs, which are what we associate with industrial work. As a result of this, union membership is going to decline steadily after 1954. Many new jobs are opening up in the service-based economy, and a large number of them are going to be in clerical or service work, which are going to provide increasing economic opportunities for women to work outside of the home. However, women are still dealing with this post-World War II expectation of being a wife, mother, and homemaker, and the cult of domesticity is still very much a part of American life. Even women who worked were still expected to fulfill all of the duties of a stay-at-home mom, essentially. So for those women who did not work outside of the home, many experienced existential issues, depression, something labeled by the writer Betty Friedan as the problem with no name. And Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, discussed these issues and challenged pre-existing gender expectations. Her book is going to become a catalyst for the modern feminist movement as more women challenge gender roles and work expectations. When you think about the 1950s, there are a lot of stereotypical images that come to mind of what life might have been like. And I think you can see in here this visual depiction kind of sums it up. Things like really nice flashy cars, fast food, teenagers hanging out, nice clean-cut family in a boring suburban neighborhood. A lot of those things are accurate. This is the prosperity we're looking at when we look at the 1950s. Television is also an important invention that really grew in popularity during the 1950s. It's going to change the way people watch movies, receive their news, understand global issues, watch sports. It's going to shape popular culture in so many ways. By the end of the 1950s, millions of Americans are going to own television sets. Another change in popular culture is the introduction of rock and roll music. Rock and roll gets its origins from blues music, boogie-woogie music, and a little bit of country music thrown in there as well. This music was essentially appealing to teenagers, which was only really becoming a thing in 1950s. Think about the baby boom and the amount of discretionary spending in American households, and you have this type of music that was marketable to this age group. This music was not popular with older generations for a variety of reasons. Social conservatives felt the lyrics were too provocative and the music was too fast and would promote promiscuity among younger generations of people. Not only that, but a number of early rock and roll performers like Little Richard and Chuck Berry were African American, so at some of these performances, it would blur lines of racial segregation, especially in the South. Elvis Presley is probably one of the best-known rock and roll performers of this age, but his dance moves were deemed so provocative that when he appeared on television to perform, he would sometimes only be filmed from the waist up. So with teenagers, you're going to see the beginnings of youth rebellion take shape in the 1950s in the form of rock and roll. And we're going to look at this topic a lot more in the next chapter. This chart shows the increasing number of women participating in the labor force from 1900 to 2012. And you can see a steady increase, a little sharper from 1940 onwards. This chart shows the percentage of American households that own a television set. And so this is going to be a pretty rapid change over the course of the 1950s. Quickly talking about politics, let's talk about Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was president for 2 terms between 1953 and 1961. Eisenhower ran as a Republican and was known for being the commander of Allied forces during World War II, as well as one of the leaders of NATO. So he was a pretty well-known figure at the time that he ran for president. His running mate was Richard Nixon, who had gained a reputation for prosecuting communists as a member of the House of Representatives and later as a senator. He's going to be Eisenhower's vice president for 2 terms, but he almost didn't get the job because right around the time of the election, he was accused of taking illegal campaign contributions. But he was able to clear his name by going on television in what's now called the Checkers speech. Basically, he told the American public, that he did indeed receive a contribution from one campaign donor, but it was a dog, and his daughters named the dog Checkers. And so basically this speech vindicated him, and it showed the power of television being able to form popular opinions and bypass political machinery and appeal directly to the American public. But as we're going to see, the television is going to bring Nixon down when we talk about Watergate, but that's a little bit in the future. When Eisenhower becomes president, he visits Korea and is able to help North and South Koreans reach an armistice in 1953. As for Eisenhower's political style, he is called the unpolitical president, in large part because he didn't get involved in the politics of his presidency. He acted more as a voice of reason and calmness to try to provide steady leadership during his time as president. Here's a map of the '52 election. After World War II, we're going to see the beginnings of the modern civil rights movement really start to gain momentum. As we talk about that, we have to understand what life was like for African Americans in the South and how they were going to challenge the institutions of white supremacy. Despite the Great Migration from World War I and World War II, 2/3 of African Americans still lived in the South. And out of that number, only 5% could legally vote because of Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised African Americans and also segregated them from society. Voting is really just the beginning of how the system kept African Americans in a subordinate role. Lack of funding for schools, discrimination in hiring practices, a lack of educational opportunities, a lack of housing opportunities, a systemic segregation in denial of services from the government, and constant threat of lynching were just some of the challenges facing the black community. So the push for civil rights is going to come from a lot of different directions. Two things I think are important to remember are the impact of television and the context of the Cold War, which you already know something about. Television is going to allow Americans all over the country to see what's directly happening to African Americans in the South. And anytime there were confrontations, protests, or someone was attacked or murdered, that information was shared with the American public rapidly, and people start to pay more attention to what's going on in the South. But also, think about America's role in the Cold War and how America was trying to present itself as a beacon of democracy and freedom in contrast to the Soviet system that oppressed its population. If that is true, it might be pretty easy for people to criticize the United States to allow its minority groups to be segregated and murdered. So there's kind of a push for our international reputation to improve civil rights. Also, as we start to look at different actions that groups took during the civil rights movement, it's important to try to think of all the ways that civil rights groups would try to dismantle white supremacy in their communities. You are going to see actions like boycotting organizations, sitting in and intentionally desegregating businesses, encouraging voter registration, and challenging registration laws. All this was done by thousands of community activists who put their lives and livelihoods on the line to try to secure these freedoms for all Americans. Two events happened in 1955 that are going to mobilize the African American community: the lynching of Emmett Till and the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, we already know that lynchings have been a part of enforcing white supremacy in the South for a long time. After black soldiers return from World War II, they are going to challenge their society, and there's going to be a subsequent lynching of about 6 black war veterans in the South after World War II. But it's Emmett Till's lynching that really draws the national attention. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy who was visiting his family in Mississippi from Chicago. He went into a store with his cousin to buy candy, and on the way out, it is believed that he made some kind of remark to the white clerk, who was a young woman. That night, the clerk's husband and brother kidnapped Till from his home and murdered him, dumping his body in the river. When Till's body was returned to his mother in Chicago, his mother insisted on having an open casket even though Till's body was badly decomposed. Pictures of Emmett Till were circulated in black publications as examples of how Southern society treated African Americans. The 2 men who murdered Emmett Till were put on trial but were acquitted by an all-white jury, and a few months later they described the murder to a journalist who paid for their story. Also in this year, the Montgomery bus boycott began with the arrest of Rosa Parks, who was a seamstress and secretary for the NAACP who refused to move to the back of a bus when a white person demanded her seat. In doing so, she broke a state law that enforced racial segregation on city buses. This mobilized the NAACP and black community in Montgomery, Alabama, because the bus company relied on the African American community to run their business, but they nevertheless enforced segregation. So the boycott of the bus line lasted for almost 1 year and was managed by a group called the Montgomery Improvement Association, who appointed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as its leader. King had just arrived to Montgomery that year, but his mobilization of the community and his oratory is going to make him nationally known by the end of this boycott. The result of the boycott was that the Montgomery bus system was desegregated. And so this is going to lead to further civil rights actions and the founding of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, where Dr. King is going to continue to challenge segregation through nonviolent actions. We've now come to the point where we're going to look at each president and their record on civil rights, because prior to President Truman, you can't say a lot about the civil rights record of any president because most presidents kind of just kept the status quo. Truman is going to start the precedent of the Democratic Party addressing civil rights issues when he commissioned a report called To Secure These Rights, which was commissioned after a number of black World War II soldiers were lynched. In 1948, Truman desegregated the federal civil service and the armed forces by executive order. As you can guess, this is going to cause some alienation within the Southern Democratic Party, who have been in control of the South since the end of Reconstruction. So just keep that in the back of your heads. If we evaluate Eisenhower's civil rights record, he had very little interest in enforcing civil rights and kind of tried to defer to the states and let them do their own thing. He's going to be reluctantly pulled into enforcing civil rights after the Supreme Court decision of Brown v. Board of Ed. In 1954, the Supreme Court decision Brown v. Board of Education is going to reverse the Plessy v. Ferguson decision from 1896 that allowed for separate but equal facilities. The NAACP Legal Defense Council successfully argued that generations of segregation had left these societies inherently unequal. The ruling required that all public schools should desegregate with all deliberate speed. So let's talk about a couple things here to make sure we understand the importance of this. This ruling applied to public schools, but not public facilities or businesses, and it did not apply to private schools. Also, the requirement that said with all deliberate speed left a lot of room for states to not really act quickly. Some school systems aren't going to be desegregated until the 1970s because of the resistance of state officials in desegregating these schools. Southern states responded with a policy they called massive resistance, a term that was adopted by Senator Harry Byrd from Virginia. Some school systems closed their doors completely for a year to block desegregation, and many states gave vouchers to white students to attend private schools where they could attend for free, and then they could still segregate and not allow black students. So you're going to see a lot of these segregation academies spring up in the 1950s. Some school boards even named schools after Confederates as a way of showing their defiance to the Supreme Court ruling. And I will leave you to guess what I am referring to with that statement. The Brown decision was a great achievement for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and was the culmination of many, many years of legal battles. But from there, civil rights groups had the constitutional backing to continue to challenge segregation. One such place where a showdown took place was in Arkansas, where 9 black students attempted to attend Central High School in Little Rock. The governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, mobilized the National Guard to block the 9 students from enrolling. Eisenhower, as you remember, wasn't really interested in civil rights, but he bristled at the idea of the governor of any state telling him what to do. And as a response, Eisenhower deployed the 101st Airborne Division, famous for jumping into Normandy on D-Day, to escort the children to and from each class. So this is one of many battles that are going to take place all throughout the South in order to provide equal opportunities in education. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act in 1957, which was the first Civil Rights Act passed since Reconstruction. It set up a Civil Rights Commission to investigate violations of civil rights, but there weren't really a lot of enforcement powers with this act. The big Civil Rights Act we're going to look at, the one you need to remember, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But we have to look at the steps that were taken and the actions taken by Congress in order to pass these acts. When we talk about civil rights and different civil rights organizations, there's a few that you need to remember. Now, CORE and the NAACP have been around for a while, CORE from around World War II and the NAACP since the early 1900s. But let's talk about these other 2 groups and their importance in the civil rights movement. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, was formed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1957 with the goal of mobilizing black churches to push for civil rights. As you might remember from previous lectures, churches were the largest and most well-organized black institution, and Dr. King himself was a preacher, so this is an attempt to link churches together to mobilize for civil rights. Another group that's going to work for civil rights is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The abbreviation is pronounced SNCC. This group is aimed at mobilizing the youth to perform direct action to challenge segregation laws. So it would recruit young college students from all around the country and organize campaigns such as sit-ins, which was intentionally integrating a public space in order to provoke a reaction from the police, and hopefully tie up the legal system to the point where businesses and organizations would be forced to reverse their policies on segregation. Later on in this chapter, we're going to look at how these organizations are going to launch campaigns to directly challenge segregation in the South and also try to provoke action from Congress and the president to bring in federal protections for civil rights. But for now, let's quickly look at Eisenhower's domestic and foreign policy. In 1954, domestic pressure and Mexican government concerns about illegal immigration led to Operation Wetback, in which 1 million Mexicans were apprehended and returned to Mexico. Some of the people apprehended and returned to Mexico were actually American citizens. The most important piece of legislation in Eisenhower's terms in office are going to be the 1956 Federal Highway Act, which authorized the construction of thousands of miles of interstate highways connecting different cities in America. This had been a plan since World War II, but it wasn't until 1956 that the federal and state governments figured out how they were going to pay for it. This is going to have important implications for the development of suburban communities, the spread of fast food restaurants and national brands, and the decline of railroads as primary means of shipping. Another important piece of information is the selection of highway routes through cities, which most often went through the lowest cost area, which usually meant that road construction disproportionately impacted communities and neighborhoods with people of color. So you're going to see entire neighborhoods destroyed and huge amounts of city blocks destroyed in historically black neighborhoods for the construction of interstate highways. It's also important to know each president's foreign policy regarding the Cold War. So let's talk about Eisenhower's for a little bit. In 1954, Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, announced the policy of boldness, which essentially funneled a lot of defense money into strategic air command and nuclear weapons. It was a form of deterrence to try to discourage the Soviets or the Chinese from acting aggressively against the United States, and it promised a policy of massive retaliation if the United States or allied countries were attacked. So comparing this to the Truman Doctrine, we would call this a little more of a militaristic response to communist expansion. The policy of massive retaliation wasn't helpful in aiding the Hungarians during their revolution in 1956. During that time, Hungary challenged communist rule within their country, which prompted the Soviet Union to invade Hungary and reimpose communist rule. The United States did not help the Hungarians, which kind of exposed some of the weaknesses of Eisenhower's massive retaliation policy. What has a lot more implications later is the intervention of the United States in Vietnam. So let's give you some backstory with Vietnam, since we're going to talk about it a lot in the 1960s and 70s. From the 1890s until the end of World War II, Vietnam was a colony of the French called Indochina, which consisted of the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. During World War II, Indochina was occupied by the Japanese, and within Vietnam, there were Vietnamese independence movements that were fighting against the Japanese. One group was called the Viet Minh and was led by a Vietnamese nationalist and communist named Ho Chi Minh. During World War II, Ho Chi Minh collaborated with American agents to fight against the Japanese. As World War II ended and the Japanese Empire crumbled, the people of Vietnam declared their independence from France, and Ho Chi Minh became the president. The French, however, did not want to let go of Vietnam and tried to reimpose colonial rule over the country. Because Ho Chi Minh was a communist, the United States took interest in supporting the French, and the ensuing French Indochina War lasted for 9 years. By the end of the war, the United States was paying 80% of the cost. The French Indochina War is going to end with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, which was an event where the Vietnamese forces surrounded the French in a remote outpost and held them under siege until the French were forced to surrender. This battle was decisive for the Vietnamese and led to peace talks on how to give the Vietnamese their independence. At the Geneva Conference in 1954, the groups that met agreed to divide Vietnam along the 17th parallel. The northern part would be led by Ho Chi Minh, and the south, a Vietnamese exile named Ngo Dinh Diem, was appointed and supported by the United States. The agreement was the elections would be held in 2 years to reunify the country. Those elections ended up never happening, mainly because Ho Chi Minh was an extremely popular figure to the Vietnamese, and the vote would most likely have resulted in unification under a communist government. Over the course of the 1950s, the United States continued to support Diem, who was battling communist insurgencies within South Vietnam. This group, the communist group, is labeled Vietnamese Communists, which is short for Viet Cong or VC. And I want you to keep that in mind if we talk about the Vietnam War. These are going to be the primary adversaries of the United States. The Vietnam conflict is going to intensify after 1964, but the roots of the Vietnam War start all the way back in 1945 with the United States involvement. Eisenhower wins re-election in 1956, and a year later the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2 into space, which are the first unmanned satellites. This comes as a shock to the United States because they underestimated Soviet capabilities, and this begins what becomes known as the space race. There's a lot of emphasis on getting a person to the moon, which Kennedy proposes in the 1960s, but it wasn't really about just getting to the moon if you think about this in the Cold War context. Whoever controlled space might have more control over the other country. Maybe they could deploy nuclear weapons from space. So there's a military application in developing this technology. The United States responds by pouring a lot of money into research and teaching science, engineering, and foreign languages in American schools. Then in 1959, the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista is overthrown and a communist leader named Fidel Castro takes over the country of Cuba. Remember how America is focused on containment policy during this time, so to have a country only 90 miles from America be under communist rule was very disconcerting to Eisenhower. The United States promptly cuts imports of Cuban sugar and imposes a trade embargo on the country, which is more or less still in existence today. We're also going to see the CIA attempt to remove Castro from power through assassination attempts and invasions, which we will see later in this chapter. We are in the post-FDR world, and the 22nd Amendment restricted anyone from being elected more than twice. Not that Eisenhower was really considering running, but that meant that in 1960 the election was open. The Republicans nominated Richard Nixon, who was an experienced statesman and had been Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years. The Democrats nominated John F. Kennedy, a one-term senator from Massachusetts who had an impressive record of service in World War II. At the time of the 1960 election, he was 43 years old, making him the youngest presidential candidate in history. He was also the first Roman Catholic to be nominated by a major party since Al Smith in the 1928 election against Herbert Hoover, and it's something that Kennedy had to kind of appeal to the American people about and try to reassure them that he was not being controlled by the Pope. His Catholicism also led to less support from Southern Protestants, so to try to gain more support from the South and to address his lack of government experience, Lyndon Johnson was chosen to be his vice presidential running mate. Johnson, who you will learn a lot more about in the next chapter, had a very long career in Congress and was the Senate Majority Leader for 8 years. To many, Kennedy represented a change in government and a kind of youthful idealism in contrast to Richard Nixon as an older and more seasoned politician. This is also an election that featured the first televised debate between the candidates, which was more or less an afterthought at the time, but in retrospect may have really tipped the scales in Kennedy's favor. People who listened to the debate on the radio thought that Nixon had won, and people who watched it on television felt that Kennedy had won the debate. So this also shows the impact that television is going to have in future political campaigns. Kennedy won the popular vote margin by only 118,000 votes, but he nevertheless wins with 303 electoral votes. One key group that was crucial to his election was African Americans, which, if you remember, had historically voted for the Republican Party. But partly because of Truman's attention to civil rights, it's going to lead African Americans to support the Democratic Party more. In a little bit, we'll talk about Kennedy's record on civil rights. This is the 1960 electoral map, and this is actually the end of part 1 of the lecture. Thanks for listening.